HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents About Us, essays from the Disabilities series of the New York Times, by Peter Catapano and Rosemary Garland Thompson. Foreword by Andrew Solomon. Read by Jonathan Todd Ross and Coleen Marlo. Foreword. The eugenics movement, spearheaded by Francis Galton in England in the late Victorian period, reached a culmination in the view that if you got rid of the misfits, you could breed a pure advantaged race. The reach of the movement was reflected in the American campaigns to sterilize disabled people, supported in a 1927 Supreme Court decision in which Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote, "It is better for all the world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime, or to let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough." Drawing on these sources, Hitler began his campaigns of genocide by gassing the disabled, presuming not only that they were polluting the larger populations, but also that they were a group no one would miss. Genetic determinism presumed that the weak and disadvantaged passed along their weakness and disadvantage, and that a systematic campaign of eliminating all but the best and strongest could improve the lot of humanity. There are 2 entwined arguments here, one about who makes disabled children, and the other about the worth of the lives of those disabled children. What sort of parents have children with disabilities? Every sort of parent. Non-disabled parents produce disabled children with startling regularity, and disabled people produce non-disabled children time and again. So that part of the argument is specious, at least when applied so specifically as Galton, Holmes, and Hitler contemplated. More relevant to this collection is the modern argument that whether disability is passed along generationally or not, it has inherent worth, and the loss of it from our society would be a troubling depletion of human diversity. That is a more radical philosophical challenge. Disabled lives are lives and are charged with inherent dignity. Most people with disabilities don't wish they had never been born. Most people with disabilities contribute to the world they inhabit. Most people with disabilities both give more to and get more from life than their non-disabled peers may be inclined to guess. Some have rich lives despite their disability, but others would say they have rich lives at least in part because of their disability. Those arguments and the lives to which they pertain are the topic of this collection. In 1968, the ethicist Joseph Fletcher wrote in the Atlantic Monthly, that esteemed journal of liberal thought, that there was no reason to feel guilty about putting a Down syndrome baby away, whether it's put away in the sense of hidden in a sanatorium, or in a more responsible, lethal sense. It is sad, yes, dreadful, but it carries no guilt. True guilt arises only from an offense against a person, and a Downs is not a person. A lot of ink has been spilled covering our society's gradual embrace of women's rights, then racial rights, and most recently gay rights. The shift in attitudes toward disability has been nearly as powerful, if less complete, but it has been much quieter. Today, no one would publish an article in the mainstream media that championed dehumanizing a group of disabled people as Joseph Fletcher did. What was once par for the course has become unthinkable. Though utilitarian philosophers such as Peter Singer have proposed that parents should have the right to murder their disabled newborns, these views are deliberately polemical, widely protested, and abhorrent to most people who encounter them. We have learned to value most people, and with that social advancement has come progress in improving their lives. Acceptance is protection. People with Down syndrome live nearly twice as long as they did in 1968, and many hold down jobs. Some are writers or actors or models. Some live at least semi-independently. That progress reflects an opening up of a society that no longer experiences the birth of a disabled child as an unmitigated tragedy, that no longer assigns chronic sorrow to the parents. This more accepting and celebratory point of view has some ascendancy in the United States, but is a work in progress both here and globally. What constitutes an identity in one society or family may be a disability in another. The sociologist Ashton Applewhite quoted a matador who said, "The bull looks different when you're inside the ring." Disability is very different for disabled people than it looks to non-disabled people. What we wouldn't have opted into is not the same as what we'd now like to change. It's hard to remember how strong the arguments were that women were lesser than men, that black people were lesser than white people, that gayness was a crime, a sin, and a disease in search of a cure. It can be hard to recollect how many people still make these arguments, how many hated being under the thumb of an African-American president, and how many abhor the idea of a female president, how many would deny basic services to gay and trans people, how many regard the disabled with polite disdain. Our society is rife with glass ceilings, and the disability ceiling has the fewest cracks in it. When I attended the 2018 annual convention of the ARC, the country's largest and oldest organization for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, I was struck by how seldom we see in common life what I saw there: the meeting of disabled and non-disabled people as equals. Increasingly, decisions about what kind of child to have are made prenatally, either through pre-implantation genetic diagnosis or through amniocentesis. An image of disability is set at the birth of a newborn child. But predictions about any individual life are always hypothetical and often wrong. In interviewing hundreds of parents of children with disabilities, I found a recurring theme of indignation from parents whose children had achieved much more, or much less, than doctors had anticipated. A baby, disabled or not, is a cipher, and only time will show how and what he or she will do. Doctors who deliver prognostications are usually representing averages. On average, certain conditions bestow certain degrees of disability, but brains and bodies are highly adaptive, and the skills of an individual child can surprise everyone. It is a tough call for doctors. Creating an atmosphere of false hope can be catastrophic. It sets families up for renewed despair with every milestone their child misses. But presuming the worst often results in the worst results. Low expectations can be a self-fulfilling prophecy. A tempered realism about the vagaries and uncertainties often obtains the best results, but parents crave assurances and doctors too often indulge that inclination. The mother of a man with dystrophic dwarfism, a very disabling condition, described to me how for the first year of her son's life, every doctor she saw rattled off a catalog of what was likely to go wrong, and asked her if she was prepared to deal with it all. When her son was a year old, a doctor who specialized in skeletal dysplasias lifted the baby up, held him aloft in the light, and said, "Let me tell you, that's going to be a handsome young man one day." The rewarding life she was to have with her son began that very day, a fact she reflected on when we chatted at his joyous wedding years later. The expectations with which a child is raised may have a strongly determining effect on what that child can do. Parents must hope for the best, but also believe that life will have meaning even with a child who achieves limited functioning. The process of forging meaning does wonders for both parents and child. A recent study looked at children with various complications at birth and found, simply, the children of mothers who had tried harder to find meaning had a better developmental outcome. How we frame disability determines how we live it, and if it is defined as calamitous from the start, the job of finding meaning is steeper than it need be. The fact that you wouldn't have chosen something doesn't mean that you can't find joyful meaning in it. Every condition manifests in a mix of inherent challenges, access challenges, and social challenges. Many people with achondroplasia, the most common form of dwarfism, have spinal compression and need surgery for it. We can fix social attitudes toward people with dwarfism all we want, and spinal decompression procedures will neither be obviated nor become pleasant. They are an inherent challenge of the condition, Challenges of access are amply addressed by the Americans with Disabilities Act, and we recognize the need for accommodations to address them. But though things are much better than they were on this front, problems persist. So someone with achondroplasia may be unable to reach the cereal at the local supermarket. The solution to this problem is not to make the LP, little person, taller, but to build grocery stores with lower shelving, or at least to give customers some tools or assistance that allow them to retrieve what they want to put in their cart. Because achondroplasia is a relatively infrequent disability, there are no standards for addressing high grocery shelves. That is a challenge of access. The social challenges are the most pernicious. It is tough for dwarfs that people stare at them and try to make iPhone videos of them when they are quietly leading their regular lives. People try to joke with them. They say derogatory things in plain earshot. They plan parties at which dwarves are the extraordinary entertainment. There is no escape from the intrusive exoticizing. These social problems of intractable rudeness are obdurate. An intellectually disabled person may not be able to parse difficult texts at the library. A physically disabled person may not be able to get up the front steps to that same library. Someone with a speech impediment may be dealt with patronizingly there. We can't make good policy unless we acknowledge that all three challenges, inherent, access, and social, are almost always in play. Negative views of disability are deeply rooted in tradition. The evil of Shakespeare's Richard III was inseparable from his hunchback. The disabled body was morally suspect. In Henry VI, Part 3, Gloucester, who would become Richard III, says bitterly, "Since the heavens have shaped my body so, let hell make crooked my mind to answer it." Disability was an invitation to degenerate behavior. He goes on, "And this word love, which graybeards call divine, be resident in men like one another, and not in me. I am myself alone." To be found grotesque is often to become grotesque. We fit other people's perceptions of us and grow into what they see. Forced into isolation by a deformity, the disabled man is infected with rancor that has no other occasion. Though we've disavowed Shakespeare's association between deformity and evil, the burden of being perceived as different persists, and it can generate isolation and rage. The best solution to this problem is community, and this book is both the locus and the proof of community. That the New York Times published these stories points to the new ways communities are being built and acknowledged, and those who read them may find redemptive community in these words. This is not to say that if Richard III had belonged to a chat group of other hunchbacks, he would have become a cheerful fellow, but only to comment that unmitigated outsiderness has always been poisonous and remains so. The essays in this book do a double trick. They normalize disability and they exceptionalize it. Disabled lives are as valid as non-disabled lives, but they are not the same. This quest to assert equality without making false claims of equivalence finds itself in this series and its politics, and echoes the quest of the women's movement, the civil rights movement, and the gay rights movement to assert their legitimacy without melting into a bland sameness with the rest of the population. The idea that disability is an identity still comes as news to much of the general population, and to many disabled people as well, but it has achieved an acceptance in the last decade or so that once seemed unimaginable. The disability op-ed series in the New York Times has been by disabled people and for both disabled people and a wider audience. Much of it is an act of translation between the experience of disabled people and the experience of non-disabled ones. Ability is both a selective and a temporary state. Any individual can do only some of what other human beings can do, and over a lifetime the level of ability generally starts low, builds to a prime, and then declines. Disabled people constitute the largest minority in America, but the disabled fail to speak with a single voice. Old men in wheelchairs too often deny their commonalities with children of autism or middle-aged people with Down syndrome. Isolationism is a national policy of separating your country from dependence on others, and I believe it has been overplayed of late. It has its human equivalent in the elevation of personal independence, independence of children from parents, of parents from extended family, of extended family from the society around them. We admire the ability of people to stand on their own 2 feet and to function without reliance on social supports. Pundits disparage those who depend on public funding. But where has this modern Western value originated? Independence is not so brave a value as we often insist, and it is also almost impossible. We live in a collective fabric, all our lives entwined with the lives of others. Human beings are social animals. Disabled people are often dependent on other people, and in our lionization of self-sufficiency we see that as a weakness. But to be more than usually dependent, or to be dependent on others for more of what one does, is not to be reduced in value. Dependency has its own particular poetry. It is a fundamental aspect of intimacy, a defining quality of love. When I first came across inclusion and mainstreaming as educational strategies, I thought they must be lovely for the disabled people whose position was advanced. Separate education is never equal, and now people with disabilities would have access to high-quality teaching among the kind of people they'd been dealing with for the rest of their lives. But I thought it might be tough on the non-disabled people, whose progress would inevitably be slowed down by the accommodations that their disabled classmates required. Now, having been in many such classrooms, I can say that the primary advantage redounds to the non-disabled children, who grow up less afraid of difference than they would otherwise be, more receptive to the intense humanity of their fellow students. They do not think that independence is success and dependence is failure. This can allow them to be more willing to acknowledge their own dependence, to tolerate their own vulnerability. Until Jason Kingsley, who has Down syndrome, began appearing on Sesame Street in the 1970s, there had been almost no disabled children publicly visible since the Victorian era, when the disabled were often sentimentalized and gathered at the family hearth. In the 20th century, people whose children were disabled tended to hide them, seldom taking them into the market squares or shopping malls or restaurants or theaters where human beings come into contact with strangers. They were squirreled away at home or ferried to institutions, an exhausting embarrassment. Now, disabled people are more visible than ever. We live in a time of great social progress when that visibility has been achieved, but we also live in a time of great medical progress, and at the same time that many forms of disability are being acknowledged as identities, they are becoming subject to cure. I believe in social progress, and I believe in medical progress, but it would be tremendous for them to be more awake to each other. Disability may coexist with shocking ability. Indeed, the shocking ability may rise in part from the depth of consciousness required of people who are disabled and who have to figure out an often bewildering world through their particular consciousness. To imagine, and I use the most obvious example, Stephen Hawking without disability, is to imagine someone else entirely. I come to this movement for rights through my struggle with depression, a mental illness that can earn you disability stripes. Depression's upside is substantial. I've learned a lot from my depression. If I had my life to do over, however, I'd wish it away. I pray that it never afflicts my children. I also belong, as we all do, to myriad other minorities. If I imagine myself without dyslexia, without ADD, without depression, without gayness, without nearsightedness, without orthostatic hypotension, without Jewishness, without white privilege, without prosopagnosia, then there's very little of me left. We are mostly an accumulation of strengths and weaknesses, of pathologized and non-pathologized conditions and identities. My grandmother used to say, everybody's got something. So this book, though it is about disability, is really in many ways about how we seek for meaning in who we are rather than in who we might have wished to be. It may be easier in the United States as it's currently constructed to be white than it is to be of color. But most people of color do not spend their time wishing they had pale skin and golden hair. Women may know that men have more privilege, but women don't in general experience that difference as one they would address by switching gender. We are our authentic selves, striving for justice, and the rest is commentary. This book is written by people with disabilities, and is therefore not representative of those disabled people who do not use language. Many who do not use spoken or written language communicate through behavior or facial expression. But those who are in common parlance referred to as the most disabled are nearly voiceless. And we cannot guess what their inner life is like. Disabled people with access to language try to project those lives, but there is much that remains unknowable, even unimaginable. This book of words cannot speak for them, but it speaks with many voices of an astonishingly broad range of challenges and victories. There's a lot of indignation in this collection, as disabled people are repeatedly denied accommodation and respect. There's a lot of sadness, too, often coincident with anger, as people find themselves marginalized and subject to prejudice. But overwhelming those hard emotions is self-belief, the conviction that disabled lives can be triumphant, and that such triumph is often sweetened by the difficulty of achieving it. Andrew Solomon. Preface. This book, About Us, collects roughly 60 essays first published in the New York Times opinion series, Disability. The series, which debuted in August 2016, was the first of its kind, a platform in a major news publication devoted to writing by and about people living with disabilities. In weekly essays over the 2-year span this collection covers, the authors of Disability reached thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands, of the New York Times readers through their stories, often igniting frank and impassioned conversations around topics and perspectives rarely aired in the media. Through their open and generous participation, these writers helped undo stereotypes and misperceptions, created unexpected human connections, and established a space in which people with disabilities can be seen and heard as they are, not as they are perceived by others. The authors of About Us represent a wide range of voices and experience. They include those with physical, motor, sensory, and cognitive differences. They are students, artists, scholars, poets, novelists, journalists, doctors, activists, and accomplished literary figures like the essayist Edward Hoagland and the neurologist and author Oliver Sacks. I sometimes like to imagine Dr. Sacks in the afterlife, observing this project approvingly. You have probably noticed that the book's title has a familiar ring. It is derived from "Nothing about us without us," the motto of inclusion and self-representation widely adopted by the disability rights movement. It also stands as our guiding editorial principle. By ensuring that people with disabilities tell their own stories, we intend to avoid and counter the sort of biased, simplified, often demeaning portrayals of them that are produced by an American popular culture designed by and for the non-disabled. There is something else that distinguishes About Us from most available literature on disability. The works here are neither academic treatises nor political advocacy. Each piece is a personal account, a relevant, clearly written, and accessible narrative, part storytelling, part argument, part oral history, intended for both general readers and those who wish to gain a deeper understanding of the lives and circumstances of people living with disabilities. They explore not only aspects of social justice and human ethics, but also revelatory moments that speak to the full human experience. First romance, childhood shame and isolation, discrimination, professional ambition, identity, childbearing, parenting, aging, and more. It is important to note that the us in About Us is no fringe population. By many estimates, roughly 1 in 5 Americans, about 60 million people, are living with a disability. It is a group legally defined to extend far beyond people with inherited genetic or congenital conditions, to include those affected by age, injury, mental or physical illness, or other life circumstances. That means that any one person can at any time enter the ranks of the disabled, and most of us certainly will. In this sense, About Us is not just about that 1 in 5, it is truly about all of us. As the founding editor of the Time series and co-editor of this book, I am often asked about its origin. Why disability? Why, in a media landscape in which virtually any subject is fair game, did we choose this one? Many wondered if I had a disability that compelled me to develop the series. I do not. Or if disability had directly touched my friends or family. It has. These factors, however, were only peripheral. There are instead a few simple answers to the essential question of why. The first motivation was journalistic. As an editor at a major media organization over the past decade, I was familiar with the significant flourishing of journalistic and literary voices from historically marginalized groups. The gay rights and marriage movement, Black Lives Matter, the LGBTQ and women's rights movements, but found no equivalent presence in the disability rights movement. In a very basic editorial sense, it was an area that needed coverage. The second motivation is probably best described as literary. While I am well aware that concise, sharply argued op-eds are the heartbeat of any news opinion section, I hoped to create a project that would have long-term value, independent of any news cycle. Somewhere in the back of my mind was the echo of Ezra Pound's much-quoted definition of literature: news that stays news. Over time, I came to believe that disability would work best by pursuing a deeper, more personal sort of expression that might build familiarity, even intimacy, between reader and writer, without the social interference, habits, barriers, and biases that normally prevent such connection in public life. I began to imagine a space, in the case of our series a digital one, where that sort of unobstructed communication and communion could take place. From the start, that meant choosing writers and essays largely based on the traditional elements of literature: voice, narrative strength, storytelling skill. I found no shortage of terrific writers among those identifying as disabled. In fact, one of the surprise outcomes of the series was the energizing effect it seemed to have on the community of fiction writers, essayists, poets, artists, and scholars with disabilities. As my work in the series exposed me to the insights and ideas of our various authors, my own thinking about disability deepened and changed. I began to see disability not as a category, but rather a spectrum on which we all occupy a place. I began to understand disability itself as a two-way street, defined not just by a person's physical or biological makeup, but also by the degree to which social and structural barriers like lack of accessibility and accommodations prevent that person's full participation in society. Among readers, reactions like this have been common. I have heard directly from many readers about the profound intellectual, emotional, and even spiritual effects that the series had on them. It is an undeniable fact that most people are socially trained to look away from disability, to avoid any person who seems too different in appearance, speech, mannerism, body shape, or size or behavior. The excuses are familiar. Direct contact with people who don't fit our ideas of sameness can be awkward or make us feel overwhelmed. In social situations, we don't know what to do, so we avoid them. By looking away, not staring, we are being polite. What the writers of About Us have accomplished in the course of this series and in this book is a subversion of these habitual avoidances. In telling their stories free of physical barriers, social habits, prejudices, and customs, the authors have entered into direct, often intimate conversation with their readers and the wider public. I see, and you may too, About Us as a collective act of social imagination. It makes a strong case for the dignity of all humans, but not by lecturing. It is a small but powerful contribution to the cause of greater understanding and community. It opens a door to the sort of full engagement.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?